Long before Saban decided to start adapting Super Sentai into Power Rangers, Marvel were exploring options to do the exact same thing. Stan Lee started developing a relationship with TOEI, which would eventually lead to an alternate version of Earth 79203 to be exact, within the Marvel multiverse. In theory, Super Sentai and Kamen Rider, or at least some seasons of it, are technically considered canon to Marvel properties. This led to somewhat of a swapping of intellectual properties, something that Marvel never really took advantage of back in the 70s and 80s, but Toei did. And as a result, we got Spiderman, the Japanese Toei TV series. Now, before we start, just to give you an idea of how different this show was from anything that Western audiences had experienced with our iterations of Spider-Man, the producers of this show were told at the time this is limited only to Japan, and for the next 30 years you are to deny ever hearing of a Japanese Spider-Man. Conveniently, after 30 years, the episode started to appear on Marvel's website, but the point is, at the time that it was being made, Marvel wanted to wash their hands of it. They weren't really interested in creating a show that would sell in the West. They wanted to know how to turn their American comic book heroes into something that would sell in Japan, and in turn see if there was any way to integrate Super Sentai or Kamen Rider into something they could sell to an American audience. It's not necessarily because they thought the show was going to be bad, but the producers were given a blanket poetic license to turn Spider-Man into a full-on tokusatsu. Like some of Toei's other products, the business ran on the sponsorship of toy companies, so one of the first things the producers did was say, if this is going to work over here, we need more toy options. Spider-Man figures alone aren't going to be enough. We need robots and cars and spaceships and gadgets. Now you need to understand just how important this series was. This is the late 70s, and Spider-Man was the first show to really introduce the idea of transforming and morphing giant robots. Yes, there were robots before, but not like we know today. Without the Japanese Spider-Man, there may well have been no Transformers, Voltron, or even Power Rangers. In fact, Transformers was a direct result of the success of the robots in this version of Spider-Man, and then the subsequent adoption of robots in Super Sentai too. That's not to say they didn't do their homework though. They studied the source material from the comics, the 60s cartoon, and even the 1977 made-for-TV movie for inspiration. Although saying that, Stan Lee hated the 1977 movie, and the Japanese producers decided to put a big emphasis on adding a lot more action. The stunt coordinator even carried pages of the comics around with him to instruct the stunt actor on movements and poses. Now, Disney Plus actually has a documentary on the production of the show and how it came to be, but what they don't do is they don't actually walk you through much of the story, so obviously that's what we need to do here. Unfortunately, it's not so easy to find the episodes to watch anymore. There are low-resolution versions of them on the Internet Archive, but generally they're pretty elusive. Marvel did actually release all of the episodes, subtitled in English, and in good resolution too, on their website a few years ago, but they've long since been removed. There was also an official DVD release in Japan, but it's so rare that it will cost you thousands. I managed to snag what I thought was an American release, but in actual fact it's just a DVD that someone burned themselves. But I think these are the episodes from the Marvel website, and they're subtitled too. So let's dive in and see what's what. The show starts with a spaceship called Marveler. See what they did there? That is heading for Earth. It was supposedly called telepathically by someone called Garia. The bad guys, the Iron Cross Army, decide that they can't risk an astroarchaeologist, Professor Yamashiro, finding it once it crash lands on Earth, as he could potentially use it as a weapon. But at this point we don't really know how. Everything moves quite quickly and it's hard to gather pace of who's who and what's happening. By the way, when they say Iron Cross Army, they do mean army. They're not afraid to pull out machine guns and rifles and just start mowing people down. The main villain is called Professor Monster, which in English sounds a bit rubbish, but apparently sounds much better in Japanese. With the completion of some battle machine monsters called BEM, he plans on taking over the Earth. His second-in-command, Amazon S, has a day-to-day alias in the outside world as an editor-in-chief of a newspaper supplement called Weekly Woman, with her photographer, Hitomi. We're also introduced to a motorcycle racer called Takuya. He keeps hearing telepathic callings for someone's brother, whilst also having visions of a spider everywhere he goes. When going to try and investigate the crash site, Yamashiro, who is also Takuya's father, is killed at the hands of a machine bem, and then Takuya is attacked by some crow-beaked putty-style grunts before falling through a pile of grey bedsheets that are actually meant to be an underground cave. In the cave he meets Garia, who refers to Takuya as his brother. Garia tells him that he is from the planet Spider, and that those responsible for his father's death are Professor Monster and the Iron Cross Army. So that Takuya doesn't die from the attack and his fall, Garia fits a bracelet and injects him with spider extract, that interestingly is black, so looks a bit more like venom. While he says spider extract, it's actually unclear throughout the series what this is exactly. At this early point in the story it seems like it's a serum, but as the series goes on it's more like Garia's blood. I don't really know how that gives him powers exactly, but it does. When he wakes, Garia tells him that he's been waiting for the one person that he can reach telepathically to find him. He needs Takuya's help for revenge, as Professor Monster attacked the planet Spider and then fled to Earth. Garia chased him but fell into the same trap, becoming stuck in the cave and being attacked by venomous spiders for 400 years, somehow surviving. I'm not sure if there's any connection between him being from the planet Spider that means he's able to endure that, or whether it's just a coincidence. It's not actually explained. There's never any indication that the people of the planet Spider actually have any spider-like qualities, even though it does give them to Takuya, so who knows. Either way, he can't go on any longer and passes the powers of Spider-Man onto Takuya before dying, but not dying. Either way, he turns into a spider and then follows him around like a telepathic mentor character. We don't exactly know how or why he turns into a spider, he just does. Maybe it's long-term exposure to spider venom, maybe it's because he's from the planet Spider, although Spider-Man can't turn into a spider, so I don't know. Back home, Spider Garia explains the purpose of the bracelet on Takuya's arm. It's his means of contacting Marveler, and it also contains his suit, or spider protector. When he pushes a button, not only does the suit pop out, but he goes through kind of a morphing sequence to become Spider-Man. He's able to crawl on walls and ceilings and also shoot webs, or at least I assume they're meant to be webs. This show has quite a low budget. He also has spider sensors, which also allow him to see the future, but only sometimes. And also, can we just take a moment to appreciate that there's no CG stunts in this show? When there's a guy hanging off a building, he's really hanging off a building. There's no harness, there's no safety net, it's literally just a rope that's obscured out of shot. They even shoot him climbing up a dam and even hanging upside down from it. We're only on episode 1 and I think we can safely say that the Japanese producers effectively invented parkour as well. When he faces the bad guys, we get glimpses of more powers, the spider string and the spider net. When one of the Iron Cross Army monsters grows giant and swings Spider-Man around like a toy, definitely not an actual toy of course, he's forced to call Marveler. And when I say call Marveler, it's more like scream for Marveler. Marveler launches a car, the GP7, which is able to fly and also fire missiles. Once docked inside Marveler, it's able to transform into Leopardon, a giant mech capable of taking on the monster, leading to, essentially, a Megazord battle. This was actually a money-saving idea because it meant that they could shoot the transformation sequence as well as the sequence with the final blow being delivered by its sword, and then use it over and over again in multiple episodes, something that was adopted into Super Sentai and Power Rangers. The fact that a spider is inside a leopard is never actually explained, and it was never really explained internally either. They also used the same shots of him climbing up the same building over and over again, also as a money-saving gimmick. But you know what? I'm already hooked. It's Spider-Man crossed with Power Rangers, and it's outrageously camp. I love it. Now, before we go any further, I need to explain the complicated situation with who's living with who, because it's deliberately convoluted, but it kind of backfires. Takuya and Hitomi are in a relationship, but the nature of it is often played down, mainly because it's a kids show and also it's Japan. He lives with his adult sister and younger brother, so they form sort of a family unit, often with Hitomi as well, without any suggestion of amorous activity out of wedlock between Takuya and Hitomi, but with the unintended side effect of it feeling like they're in a throuple with a young son. You definitely don't get the feel that it's two brothers and a sister living together with the older brother's girlfriend always visiting. It feels like a man and his two wives, one of whom has a son. In episode 2, we learn the fate of the planet Spider. Professor Monster had attacked while Garia was away from home. On his return, he found all of his people dead and vowed revenge against their killer. He followed Monster to Earth, where the professor had been using the chaos of a Japanese civil war to hide while he did his research on creating his machine BEM monsters. Garia possessed the powers of Spider-Man, although we don't know if anyone else from the planet Spider does, but was cast into the cave. He told Marveler to flee into space to avoid falling into Monster's hands. The reason he was able to survive for so long is because people from the planet Spider, or Spiderians as I've decided to call them, age 20 times slower than those on Earth. So the 400 years that he was in the cave, for Garia was only really 20. But now Takuya is his heir, with Garia's blood flowing through his veins. Oddly though, while they're explaining all this, Takuya is in a church brooding while they keep juxtaposing Garia with Jesus, and I don't really understand why. That definitely never comes up again. But now that Takuya has embraced his new powers, Garia dies, but actually dies this time. I don't know if that was the intention all along, or whether they just weren't sure how long they could get away with filming an actual living spider tied to a piece of string. Episode 3 feels like an homage to the classic episode from the 1967 Spider-Man cartoon, Double Identity, where a thief poses as an imposter Spider-Man. After all, the suit for this show was styled on that cartoon, so it makes sense that they'd pay tribute to at least some episodes. In the Japanese show, a machine BEM is able to brainwash a cat burglar into becoming an imposter Spider-Man, tagging his name at crime scenes. What's interesting though is that rather than having him also in a Spider-Man suit, his suit resembles the Night Monkey suit from Spider-Man Far From Home. Episode 4 introduces yet more powers, in that Spider-Man also has night vision and can also heal himself at extraordinary rates, like Wolverine. But also the bracelet is able to emit ultrasonic waves that can act as a detector of machine BEM footprints. Later we see that it can also be used to detect whether someone is an Iron Cross army member in disguise. And Leopardon also has a special type of vision that allows him to see through smoke screens, although it doesn't really come up that often. Apparently Leopardon also has rocket fists too, but for some reason these aren't introduced until 3/4 of the way through the season, and are rarely utilised even at that. Now, even though Garia is dead, Spider-Man is not a lone wolf. Set between episodes 10 and 11 is a movie that accompanies the series. While it was released theatrically, it's actually the same length as a normal TV episode. It uses the same opening credits and actually fits into the continuity of the show too, but it's filmed in widescreen and graded slightly differently from the rest of the small screen episodes. In the film, Spider-Man becomes an ally of Interpol, who are also trying to take down the Iron Cross army. Later scenes with Interpol often appear like a war on a mafia syndicate, but this is only to pad the season out a bit. Essentially, Interpol end up using him as kind of a spy. In episode 15, Spider-Man discovers that Hitomi's editor is actually Amazon S, but when he tells Hitomi, she doesn't take it too well, only it gets dropped for some reason and doesn't get picked up again until much later in the season. Amazon S's secret identity disappears for a while, and she occasionally takes up other aliases elsewhere. But Takuya has been on the Iron Cross army's radar for a while. They suspect that he is actually Spider-Man, only when they look closer they see him as just a fool who keeps cropping up everywhere. They do still suspect that he's Spider-Man, but every time they follow him they end up writing him off. Now, normally when I do videos like this, I try to present the whole story arc, but with Spider-Man, a lot of the season is what I would normally refer to as filler episodes. What I mean by that is, a lot of the episodes are self-contained, so if you're dipping in and out of the show week by week, you don't really miss much in terms of the overarching story that's woven throughout the season. So for the rest of this review, the order isn't as important. Skipping way ahead to episode 27, Professor Monster is able to gather the spiders from Garria's cave and is able to obtain some spider extract, but not to create another Spider-Man. I think because they'd need Garria's blood for that, but again, it's never really clear what exactly the extract is. Instead, they use it as a scent for tracker dogs to hunt down Spider-Man. And I struggled with this episode because one of the dogs nearly dies and it's the spitting image of Micaiah, but even a Sentai style show wouldn't let a dog get killed. People, fine, but killing dogs is too far. In fact, people get killed in just about every episode, even getting blown up by a car bomb. Some scenes you'd think were straight out of a gritty mobster movie. In one episode, a young boy accidentally captures someone being murdered on camera, in what is essentially a Boy Who Cried Wolf storyline. The body count for this show is huge. At one point, a boy's sweet grandfather is thrown from a cliff to his death because he used to be a jewel thief and the Iron Cross army wanted to steal one of his jewels. And that's it, there's no comeback at all. He's just dead and we move on to the next episode. In another episode, a woman gets possessed by a monster and sends a car flying off a cliff with 3 men still in the back seat, all of them dying in a fireball. And then later in the episode, she decides that she'd rather die than live as a machine bem, so burns herself to death. And don't give me that, it's not just a kids show, it's for adults too. It was specifically written as a kids show to sell toys. Just because adults can enjoy it too, doesn't mean that it's not a bit much. Imagine them throwing a scene into Shrek where someone gets burnt alive. Oh, wait, AVGN already did that, didn't they? Not to mention, a woman is thrown to her death from her own balcony in episode 12 because another woman was tricked into becoming a pawn of the Iron Cross army, and then by the end of the episode she can't live with herself so jumps off a building herself. I imagine multiple suicides is not really something that would get through regulators today. Later in the story, Amazoness contacts Hitomi and confesses who she really is. Even though they don't know that it's Takuya, they suspect that she's close to Spider-Man and use her to draw him out. But Professor Monster gets fed up of her constantly pursuing Takuya. Too bad for her that when she finally catches Spider-Man, she's unable to reveal his real identity as he's able to produce endless masks. I guess maybe that's a feature of the suit, that it can't be forcibly removed? I don't know, this is the only time that it happens and it's never explained. In episode 35, we get 2 new members of the Iron Cross army called Bella and Rita. But honestly, I have no idea where they came from. They start off as mummies, but Professor Monster says that they're 10 million years old. He performs surgery on them to make them look like nuns sleeping in coffins, but when they wake up, they turn into sexy Rambo. It's all a bit weird and they're featured heavily from this point on, but don't actually do or say much. Although you've got to appreciate that they dressed up some stuntmen in drag for some of the fight scenes. We also get a rival for Amazoness with Dr. Miracle. Dr. Miracle is a shapeshifter that's able to take up the form of lots of different monsters depending on the battle. He's able to capture Spider-Man, briefly, but he doesn't last very long as Amazoness and the sexy Rambos turn their back on him and he's quickly destroyed by Leopardon. Now the weird thing is, there's no great build up to the end of the season. You get to episode 41 with absolutely no idea where the story has been going or even that it's about to come to an end. It almost feels like they were hoping to add another 10 episodes to the season or something, but it never got approval, so it all just gets kind of wrapped up in one clumsy, quick episode. Bella and Rita release poison gas into the Interpol headquarters, and we're told that Amazoness is worried about how close they're getting to Professor Monster. But we never really see that. I mean, they only debuted 6 episodes ago, and they've hardly had any lines whatsoever. So maybe there are some lost episodes that got written but never got approval to make? We'll never know. Anyway, A mole had informed Spider-Man of the impending attack, so he was able to warn Interpol in time and they were ready, waiting for Amazon S's attack. Apparently someone has also been leaking him information about the Iron Cross Army base locations as well, but again this is just handled in exposition, we never actually see this at any point. But this is where it gets really rushed and confusing. Professor Monster was the one that was leaking information to Spider-Man, partly to test whether Amazon S could actually get the job done, and also because he's decided to abandon all of their current bases and set up base in the Amazon instead, which, despite the name, has nothing to do with Amazon S. Bella and Rita are from the Amazon, and the Professor is now putting his trust in them. Presumably he's fed up of Amazon S's failure all the time, although Bella and Rita aren't much better. I mean, they get killed within their first couple of episodes and have to be brought back to life by a monster's serum. But anyway, they apparently have a rocket ship now, and they're going to target every major city on Earth with H-bombs, which did have a little bit of foreshadowing, but not much. So Professor Monster gives Amazon S an ultimatum and tells her to go kill Spider-Man and not to return until she's done so. She turns up at Takuya's house and kidnaps Hitomi. After all, she's always suspected that Spider-Man is really Takuya, although after a quick beating she's still not convinced, but at least she knows that he's in contact with Spider-Man, so leaves a message to come and save Hitomi. She gets her proof of his identity, as she smeared poison on her whip when beating Takuya, and it's starting to kick in now that he's transformed. She thinks she manages to defeat him and returns to the base, but she loses a bracelet that Spider-Man is able to use to track her down. Monster attempts to flee in the rocket and signals Bella and Rita to kill Amazon S for her deception, only she's then able to flee in the rocket, but it's shot down by someone, it's not really clear who. But regardless, she's now dead, and apparently no H-bombs exploded either. And then in a final battle, Spider-Man kills Monster, but we don't really see what happens to Bella and Rita. I think that he kills them, but considering deaths are not subtle in this show, it's hard to pinpoint when exactly it's meant to have happened. Now, even though I enjoyed the show, there's absolutely no sense of structure whatsoever. If you wanted to get a good sense of the show, all you'd need to do is watch the first half a dozen episodes or so, and then you could skip right to the very end, and you wouldn't have really missed anything in the way of exposition. This is the kind of show that you can just put on any random episode on and enjoy it for 25 minutes without having to think too hard. There's a couple of side characters that appear in multiple episodes, but still, it wouldn't really be that confusing if you missed their introduction. It's only really if you missed the movie that then the sudden appearance of Interpol would appear confusing, as I did actually miss the movie first and was wondering where the hell this came from. The lack of story progression is disappointing, but it also means that there's no real plot holes either, as continuity isn't as big a deal. But sadly, there's a lot of interesting ideas that could develop into story arcs, but they just don't bother. When watching the series, my wife watched a couple of episodes and was actually getting into it, as she thought there was going to be a big whole story arc based around a giant diamond, but no. The Iron Cross Army kills a boy's grandfather and try to steal a map to the diamond, but Spider-Man kills the monster of the week, and that's it. They never try to pursue him or the map again, even though he's more vulnerable now than he was before the episode. There are plenty of good messages for kids though, and almost every episode is wrapped up with a moral. Ironically, there's even an anti-magic mushrooms episode, and I mean that quite literally. There's a monster that grows hallucinogenic mushrooms, although I can't imagine where they got that idea from. I do like how, because Leopardon is one of the first transforming robots, they don't really know what to put on the console to make it look technical, so he just has an old school phone. I like to imagine that when he's hungry he just screams, "Marvel!" and then just cruises around like... Yeah, I'd like a large pepperoni, but no anchovies.
And I mean no anchovies. You put anchovies on this thing and you're in big trouble, okay?
While there's almost no connection to the American version of Spider-Man, I do like the little nod to Peter Parker being a freelance photographer by making Hitomi a newspaper photographer as well. while Takuya being a motorbike racer is almost certainly a nod to Kamen Rider. And there's little touches that feel like they were the inspiration for future Western products, but probably weren't, like a giant brain machine bem from episode 2 that is kind of like Krang from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or Spider-Man using spider string to slow down a train like he does in Spider-Man 2, or as I mentioned, the Night Monkey suit. Interestingly, there could have even been a spin-off sequel to this, or even a second season that introduced Spider-Boy. In episode 5, a young boy, Ichiro, is mowed down by the Iron Cross army after discovering them stealing missiles, the foreshadowing to the end of the season. And Takuya gives some of his blood to save the boy's life. As such, he also has Garrier spider blood flowing through his veins, and seems to be able to communicate telepathically, although we don't know about any of the other powers. Ichiro makes a couple of appearances throughout the series, even saving Takuya's life by a blood transfusion the other way when Professor Monster and Amazon S poison him. But he disappears after the first dozen episodes or so and is never shown again. There could have also been a Spider-Girl, as in episode 33 we learn that Professor Monster's ship exploded after a raid on the planet Spider, and his treasure haul was scattered across Earth. A young girl's father found a spider pendant from the explosion, and it gives her super strength when she wears it. But sadly they don't develop the story, as the girl feels that she's holding on to grief from her dead parents too much, so gives the pendant to Spider-Man. And I get it, a lot of these episodes do have a moral wrapped up each week, which was one of the reasons the stories pass quite quickly, but she could have been Spider-Girl. That seems like a lost opportunity to sell toys to me. But the real hero of this show is the stuntman in the suit. I mean, he climbed Tokyo Tower without a safety rope, he clung onto moving cars without a safety rope, he was hung from a suspension bridge and even swung from it, he had explosions being set off as he was running over them, they even hang him from a helicopter in one episode, and suspend him from a crane in another, and then dangle him from the roof of a building too. God knows how they didn't have more accidents during filming. To be fair, the show didn't have a huge budget, and at times, it does show. It's interesting though, because the show was actually a success in Japan, but when it was showed to American executives, they hated it and mocked the main publisher. That is until Stan Lee stood up after the first screening and professed that he loved it. So it's odd that it remained under wraps, or at least officially, for so long. The thing is though, Marvel seem to be embracing it now. While the show isn't officially online anymore, they did go to the trouble of producing a whole documentary on the show. But what about the comics? Does Earth 79203 Spider-Man appear in any of the American comics? Well, actually yes. Both Takuya and Leopardon appear multiple times in the Spiderverse series of comics. But again, it's surprisingly rare considering that the show was actually pretty good. I don't know why Disney wouldn't want to start monetizing the toy potential, unless the rights are somehow still tied up with Poppy, which is now owned by Bandai, I suppose, but even so I would have thought that it was worth it. In terms of Spider-Man existing in other universes, it's less clear-cut, but there was actually a crossover with Kamen Rider. As far as I can tell, this is only in the form of a manga, but it also uses real photos. Some are composite panels, but there are actually custom photographs taken for this story too, but the canon is a bit unclear. Honestly though, if I was growing up in Japan in the 70s, this would have easily been a weekly watch for me, and it would have then snowballed with Super Sentai too. But, as influential as this was, it's not where it started. There was Kamen Rider before this, so maybe we need to take a look at that franchise next. But there's plenty of time for that. In the meantime, please make sure you like, comment and subscribe. It really does make a difference to the growth of the channel, and I will see you all next time.